So, Bret recently hit the headlines once again when he verbally shot on Bill Goldberg for ending his career back at WCW Starrcade 1999. I'm James, and while you probably know the answer already, I'm here to explain the full story about why Bret Hart has issues with Bill Goldberg. So, just over a week ago, Bret was doing an online remote signing. You know the types. Fans pay money and watch their heroes autograph stuff. They're the ones that became popular during the COVID lockdown. So, while idly autographing 8x10s of himself for paying customers, the Hitman was asked a standard question about dream opponents he never got to wrestle. Kurt Angle would have been one of my primary guys. He always wanted to work with me and I wish I could have worked with him. I would have loved to have worked with Brock Lesnar just because I always heard he was a good pro in the ring. The opposite of Goldberg. Sort of throwing Goldberg's name out there for a good dig seemingly out of nowhere, but Bret wasn't finished at calling Bill unprofessional. I always thought that if Goldberg got into the Hall of Fame, then Horowitz should have got into the Hall of Fame. This can be interpreted as either a compliment to Barry's talents or Goldberg's perceived lack of talent as far as Bret's concerned, or probably both. Bret continues. Horowitz can actually wrestle. Goldberg never could. I think he got in for hurting everybody he worked with. They should take Goldberg out. Pretty strong words, especially considering some of the more shady characters WWE has left in the Hall of Fame over the years. The relationship between Bret and Bill wasn't always so frosty. In fact, Bret detailed in his book how impressed he was when he first met Goldberg after joining the WCW, although word on the street in WCW even in early 1998 was that some of Bill's opponents were getting hurt. Bret first worked with Goldberg during the famous steel plate angle in the spring of 1999. The idea was to build Bret up with wins on TV before challenging Goldberg to a one-on-one in-ring confrontation in Toronto, Canada, the home country of the fiercely proud Canadian, with an eye for Bret to then feud with Hulk Hogan in the autumn. You should know what happened, but essentially, come the Toronto show, Bret got on the microphone, challenged that big chicken William Goldberg, which he had no relationship to in storyline, to face him in the ring. Goldberg comes out and immediately spears Bret. This time though, Goldberg stayed down. Bret eventually rallies around, rolls Bill over and counts his own pinfall before lifting his Toronto Maple Leafs jersey to reveal the steel plate responsible for KOing William, covering his abdomen. Then he grabbed the microphone and announced, "I quit." Now, Bret hadn't really quit, of course, despite rumours circulating at the time that Bret was returning to the WWF to turn the very real Montreal screwjob situation into a money-making angle with Vince McMahon. The Bret Goldberg storyline returned 6 weeks later when Bret ran in during a Goldberg vs Sting match at the Slamboree pay-per-view, attacking Goldberg with a chair. The feud was then scrapped entirely due to real-life circumstances when Owen Hart died at the Over the Edge pay-per-view for the WWF a couple of weeks later. A side note, Bret was scheduled to make his in-ring return to face WCW champion Kevin Nash on Nitro the day after the Over the Edge pay-per-view, but instead Bret stayed home indefinitely and contemplated retiring from wrestling for good. Now, as we all know, Bret returns to wrestling, and in fact he actually returned 3 months later on the house show circuit, wrestling now WCW champion Hulk Hogan to the no contest starting in late August. Shortly after his return, Bret and Goldberg would share the ring numerous times in singles matches, four-way matches, tag matches, and also would briefly team up to win and lose the WCW tag titles in December. Without getting into the unbearably convoluted and increasingly pathetic WCW World title picture, which in late 1999 would see 5 world champions in a row vacate the world title, Bret vs Goldberg was scheduled for WCW's supposedly biggest event of the year, Starrcade, on December 19th. With Bret's ribs already tender from taking a number of previous spears from Goldberg, Bret said the following infamous words before their Starrcade main event bout. "Whatever you do out there, Bill, don't hurt me." During the match, Bill whispered an apology to Bret after he caught him with an elbow that legitimately dazed him. A few minutes of action later, Goldberg threw Bret into the ring ropes, whispering, "Watch the kick," during an Irish whip, an instruction so vague Bret didn't quite know what to expect as he hurtled back toward the centre of the ring. With little time to prepare, Goldberg landed a sidekick that went straight through Bret's hand and landed flush up under his chin. In his book Hitman, Bret described the blow as feeling like, "Someone chopped me with a hockey stick, an agonising blow that sent me crashing to the mat where I lay holding my neck just behind my right ear at the base of my skull. I was thinking I've got to get up for the finish, but I can't remember what it is." While Bret did indeed manage to get to the finish of the match, the damage was very much done. Bret suffered a severe concussion from the blow and was confused and slurring his speech in the aftermath, and there wasn't even a doctor backstage to properly deal with the injury. Bret, who would turn heel and become the leader of the revived NWO the next day, would wrestle a couple more weeks, including Goldberg again the next day on Nitro, as well as a seriously ill-advised hardcore match with Terry Funk, with Jerry Flynn, who kicked him full force in the ribs, with the always snug Chris Benoit, and several house shows against Ric Flair and Sid Vicious before wrestling his final match against Kevin Nash on the 10th of January 2000. Now that's if you discount those later WWE performances where he couldn't take bumps or be hit in the head, which I do discount them. Bret was diagnosed with a severe concussion as well as a hole in the neck the size of a quarter, as well as more muscle in his neck that felt to the doctor's touch like hamburger meat. Goldberg's errant kick had cost Bret his in-ring career, and in Bret's estimation he lost about $16 million in like 1 second. I just signed with WCW for $3 million a year for another 3 years on top of the 2 years I had left on my original contract, so it was bad timing and unfortunate. If I'd lost $16 million, unfortunate would not be a strong enough word to convey my emotions. Goldberg later said, "It was an honour and a privilege to work with Hart, and I very much looked up to him and listened to everything he said. Accidents happen, and he was an idol of mine, still is, and that's one thing I'll forever be remorseful for is the misplaced kick. He did kind of know it was coming, but there are a couple of things in my career that I wished I could have changed. That was one of them. The length that I had an angle with him, and my inability to be professional enough to pull the kick, but it meant very much to me to be believable. Still, Bill tried to one-up his previous efforts at Starrcade by almost killing himself on the following WCW Thunder 4 days later. After chasing Bret to the back, Goldberg found the limo that supposedly contained the powers that be, aka WCW writers Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara. The script called for Goldberg to smash the windows of the limo with a piece of pipe, but somewhere along the way the pipe was dropped or lost. Goldberg, who was a gorilla of a man with intensity to match, smashed the windows with his bare forearm and elbow and, in the process, sliced through an artery in his arm that saw him lose so much blood he nearly lost his arm and potentially his life and spent the next 6 months on the shelf. Bret made a fair few appearances for WCW on television and house shows and personal appearances in 2000, as WCW could fire him at any time after 6 weeks if he couldn't wrestle. Sadly, not that many people within the company believed that the speech-slurring Bret was genuinely hurt, as so many wrestlers in WCW had faked injuries so that they could stay home and collect their guaranteed paychecks. Bret and Bill later hugged it out when they saw each other at the Nitro show on August 28th, with Bret later adding, "Bill's a good man. Unfortunately, he'd been pushed too fast and didn't understand his brute strength." Then Bret would attack Goldberg on TV with a rubber shovel and bury Bill alive in the New Mexico desert, followed by a later interaction at a subsequent show to build to a Bret-Goldberg feud that can never culminate in a match, as Bret had since been told his head injury was so severe he would never wrestle again. As far as being buried in the desert goes, it's just a shame Goldberg hadn't got to Russo in that limo while he had the chance. Then, after they'd already cut his pay twice, WCW fired Bret on October 19, 2000 in classic WCW fashion via FedEx. In the years that followed, Bret's retelling of events always took a more compassionate tone toward Bill and described the events as unfortunate, such as on the WWE-produced Hitman DVD where Bret said Bill had a tendency to injure everyone he worked with, but qualified the comments by describing Bill as good-hearted. Bret and Bill have remained friendly since the kick, but in later years, Bret has become more prickly in his comments toward Goldberg and his abilities, and the remote signing interview wasn't the first time Bret questioned WWE's decision to induct Bill into their Hall of Fame. In 2019, Bret told Sean Mooney, "I don't know how you give a guy a Hall of Fame thing for hurting as many wrestlers as Bill Goldberg hurt, and without consequence. He usually got a pat on the back and told how good of a job he did out there, when you're scraping the wrestler that worked with him off the mat." Bill himself has talked about the incident many times, always offering public apologies and accepting responsibility. But back in July of 2022, Bill was interviewed on the Michael Kay show where he had reached his limit of saying sorry while still being publicly chastised by Bret, who's always claimed that Bill kicked him full force intentionally. "I will take it to my grave because I am sure that he will never forgive me. But hey man, what else can I say? I said I was sorry and that it was unintentional and it was the furthest thing from my mind, I don't know, 1,000,000 times. And of those 1,000,000 times, Bret's come back with, yes, it was intentional and he's a punk and he didn't know what he was doing and he ruined my career. You know it sucks, but you can lead a horse to water and you can shove their face in the damn water, but you can't make him suck it up the esophagus. So if you can tell that I'm pretty pissed off about the fact that he still harbours it, yeah, it sucks. I truly believe that it just shows what a human being I am, in that I can forgive people for even accusing me of something that's not true." Even Goldberg's trainer at WCW's power plant facility, Dwayne Bruce, waded into the debate, somehow blaming Bret for the entire thing. He said there was no influence on protecting or pushing in the ring at the power plant. That's quite the opposite. I think it's shame on Bret. He's been a veteran in his sport, getting the ultimate push that anybody's ever got, and if he don't know to get his hand up, that's his fault. That's the way I look at it, and I'm not trying to talk bad about anybody, I'm just talking. That's about the stupidest take on the situation possible, especially as Bret did get his hand up and Bill kicked straight through it. Bret also constantly makes the point that Goldberg had hurt everybody he worked with. While this is clearly untrue, I also couldn't find anybody else that Bill had hurt seriously while wrestling aside from maybe Vince Russo, who should never have been in the ring in the first place. Bill did nearly kill The Undertaker at the tragic Saudi Arabia Super Showdown show in 2019, but Bill has more been a danger to himself as much, if not more, than he was to anybody else. How can we forget the limo punching that nearly cost him his arm? And to make matters worse, a couple of weeks after returning from that catastrophe after 6 months of recovery, Goldberg separated his shoulder in a match with Booker T on Nitro. During his WWE run in 2003 to 2004, Stephanie McMahon asked Bill to stop headbutting doors in an effort to psych himself up. So Bill punched the door instead and broke his hand. And that ritual of Goldberg headbutting doors was also partly responsible for the Super Showdown stinker, as Bill concussed himself caveman nutting a door before heading to the ring. That, and the combined 107 years of age and lack of recent ring time between he and Taker also didn't help matters. Another point to hit out is that Bret called Goldberg a 0 out of 10 as a wrestler, when clearly that's not true either. Bill was hardly a technical whiz, but he was hugely dynamic, his explosiveness was unparalleled, he was the most popular and most over wrestler in WCW, and Goldberg was frequently the best thing on WCW programming. At least he was until Kevin Nash cut his legs off when he booked himself to beat Bill at Starrcade 98. It was also partially WCW as a whole's fault for not reining in Bill more as far as physicality goes, but that's what got him over in the first place. You live by the sword, and you die by the sword. One last point to bring up is that a couple of years after the career-ending kick, Bret suffered a stroke after taking what was a fairly innocuous fall onto some grass from his bicycle when he hit a pothole. Did the concussion he suffered at Starrcade leave him vulnerable to even more serious injury in later life? Quite possibly, and Bret certainly seems to think so. When Bill Goldberg kicked me, I could see stars. Then when I had my stroke, I remember lying on the grass and I could see just out of my left eye, not the right one. It was a million stars in my left eye, and I remember going, the concussion. Is Bret justified over his bitterness toward Bill for ending his career? It was an accident and it was over 22 years ago, but is that something you could see yourself getting over if it happened to you, if you lost your career and it changed your life forever? And what if the kick led to the stroke that Bret spent years recovering from just to get the majority of his mobility back? Head trauma brings with it its own unique set of challenges, including potentially altering the sufferer's personality and the ability to control emotions, and a common trait in those with brain injuries is an inability to stop fixating on certain things. It may not be bitterness driving Bret's unhappiness toward Bill, but a powerlessness to stop obsessing over the incident in the first place. Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please give me a like and a subscribe, and please let me know what other content you'd like to see from WSI or the James Romero channel or anything else in the future. Thank you very much for watching.